The air was thick with solemnity. Westminster Abbey stood wrapped in an almost spiritual silence, its towering spires cloaked in gray clouds as the world watched the funeral procession of Queen Elizabeth II. It was a moment etched in British history, a final farewell to the longest reigning monarch, the last symbolic thread tying modern Britain to its imperial past. And yet, behind the sea of ceremonial splendor, military precision, and grief-stricken faces, something else unfolded, something never meant to reach the public eye. Now, nearly 2 years later, disturbing footage has resurfaced, and it's beginning to fracture the well-crafted narrative of that historic day. Shocking and unexpected, the video does not depict statecraft or sorrow. It allegedly captures Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, engaged in an explosive moment of anger. A moment where food was hurled. A moment where a palace staffer was humiliated. A moment where silence was enforced, not with compassion, but with coercion. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Why didn't anyone speak up back then? Why was there no public mention of this incident during the funeral's massive media coverage? Was it truly buried to protect the royal family? Or did Meghan herself play a role in ensuring it was never brought to light? These are the questions now being asked in a storm of public opinion, journalism, and institutional reflection. But to understand the gravity of this moment, we must begin not with the footage, but with the funeral, the atmosphere, and the heavy emotional undercurrent that pushed everyone to their edge. The day began with all the precision expected of a British royal funeral. Rows of dignitaries and heads of state filled the pews, wearing black, their faces frozen in rehearsed sadness. The Queen's casket was a sight of regal finality. Draped in the royal standard, adorned with the imperial state crown, and carried with an elegance only centuries of protocol could perfect. Yet for those who looked beyond the front rows, beyond the flashing cameras, there were cracks forming in the controlled symmetry of the event. One of those cracks, according to now-leaked footage and insider testimony, widened dramatically behind the scenes. As the camera panned across the royal family, Charles with a clenched jaw, Camilla composed yet cold, William stoic. One figure stood out, not for her grief, but for the tension she exuded. Meghan Markle, flanked by Prince Harry, appeared tightly wound. Her smile was absent, her posture stiff. And for insiders present that day, the Duchess was reportedly short-tempered and unusually assertive with palace staff from the very beginning of the morning. Several accounts suggest that in the hours leading up to the funeral, Meghan grew increasingly impatient over logistics. Staffers whisper of a confrontation in one of the Abbey's preparation chambers, where Meghan allegedly erupted over a late breakfast tray that did not meet her dietary expectations. Aides scrambled to correct the issue, only to be met with colder glares and sharper words. But that moment, as severe as it might have been, pales in comparison to what reportedly happened next. According to multiple sources and the leaked footage making waves online, Meghan confronted a junior staffer near the corridor adjacent to a catering station just before the official procession was about to begin. The footage, captured on a phone not authorized by palace protocol, appears to show Meghan speaking with visible irritation. The young staffer, appearing flustered and overwhelmed, tries to explain something, perhaps a delay, perhaps a logistical issue, but what follows is anything but diplomatic. The video allegedly shows Meghan picking up a plated food item, possibly a quiche or small tart from the catering tray, and throwing it toward the staffer with what witnesses described as deliberate aim. It wasn't just a frustrated gesture, it was personal. And more disturbing still is what followed, an alleged demand from Meghan to the shaken aide to not mention this to anyone, with words described by insiders as chilling in tone. The staffer reportedly nodded, held back tears, and quickly exited the corridor. Why didn't the media report this? Why didn't palace officials acknowledge it? The answer lies in a murky combination of fear, protectionism, and an almost religious devotion to controlling the royal narrative. Queen Elizabeth's funeral was not simply a goodbye. It was a performance for the world, a final showcase of dignity, unity, and royal endurance. Any disruption, especially one involving a royal in disgrace, would have tarnished the pageantry, and the institution had no tolerance for blemishes. Within hours of the incident, According to several internal sources, security was quietly deployed to retrieve and suppress any unauthorized footage. Phones were checked, staff interviewed, and a vague threat was issued to those closest to the event. This moment never happened. And if it did, it will not leave these walls. But as with all secrets kept by force, truth has a way of resurfacing, eventually. And it has. The video that's now surfacing online is grainy, but unmistakable. Though palace representatives continue to issue flat denials, independent analysts have begun verifying the authenticity of the file through forensic breakdowns. Voice analysis, facial recognition, even timestamp metadata all suggest the clip is real. And while Meghan's defenders are calling it out of context and potentially manipulated, the avalanche of insider accounts pouring in only seems to reinforce the damning narrative. What does this mean for Meghan? For Harry? For the staffer whose humiliation became a whispered secret? More importantly, what does it mean for the institution that chose silence over truth in its most sacred moment of transition? This video aims to unpack not only the event itself, but the machinery behind it. The palace's decision to protect image over justice, Meghan's alleged pattern of explosive behavior with subordinates, and the emotional toll endured by those deemed invisible by royalty. We will walk through each layer. The funeral, the incident, the cover-up, the resurfacing, and the fallout now gripping the public. We will hear from those close to the event. We will examine every suppressed detail. And most of all, we will ask the difficult questions, not just about what happened, but about why and who benefited. Because in a monarchy built on secrets, ceremony, and self-preservation, even food can become a weapon, and silence a prison. This is not just a story about scandal. It is about power, control, and the cost of protecting illusions at the expense of people. And if the footage is real, and more testimony keeps pointing in that direction, then this single act of disrespect has become more than just a personal failure. It has become a symbol of everything the public fears lurks behind royal curtains. The day of Queen Elizabeth II's funeral was more than just a ceremony. It was a historic milestone that unified the globe in grief. An estimated 4.1 billion people tuned in to witness the final chapter of a reign that had shaped modern British identity for over 70 years. Black-clad mourners lined the streets of London, some weeping, others silently clutching Union Jack flags. There was reverence, formality, and a profound sense of finality. The ancient traditions of monarchy unfolded in real time. The slow procession of the casket through the heart of the capital, the ceremonial guards in red and gold, the somber toll of Big Ben echoing through every corner of the United Kingdom. Cameras captured it all, every bow of the head, every tear-soaked embrace, creating the illusion that the entire royal family stood united, composed, and immersed in dignified mourning. But what the world couldn't see, was the hidden drama unspooling beyond the reach of official cameras. While millions were focused on the spectacle outside, something far more unsettling was occurring just out of frame. It wasn't in the grand halls of Westminster or the stone chambers of Windsor Castle. It was in the service corridors and back rooms, the places where royal staff worked tirelessly to maintain the image of seamless perfection. And on that day, amid the orchestration of Britain's most sacred royal farewell, it was in those very corridors that a disturbing scene allegedly took place. One that would remain buried for nearly 2 years. The footage that has now resurfaced, shocking, grainy, and allegedly damning, paints a much different picture than the polished narrative shown to the world. It's not the somber silence of a royal mourning that dominates the leaked video. It's the sharp, stinging sound of conflict. It's the frozen expression of a young palace staffer, shocked and humiliated, and the unmistakable image of Meghan Markle allegedly lashing out with food, in an act of frustration and fury that no camera was ever meant to catch. The contrast between what the public saw and what actually occurred behind closed doors is more than unsettling. It's disturbing. On the surface, the royal family presented a carefully rehearsed tableau of grief, strength, and unity. But beneath that composed exterior, tensions simmered. Palace staff were on edge. Everyone walked on eggshells, trying to maintain decorum in the most emotionally volatile environment imaginable. And while most insiders bore the strain silently, some, like the young woman at the center of this now infamous altercation, bore the brunt of something far worse. To understand why this incident matters so deeply, one must first understand the sheer emotional and political weight of the Queen's funeral. It was not merely a state event. It was the transition of an entire era. Queen Elizabeth had been a constant, a fixture in global consciousness. Her death marked not only the end of a monarch's reign, but the symbolic severing of continuity for millions. As such, the stakes for the royal family to present a flawless public face were astronomically high. Any hint of controversy, scandal, or disorder would have been catastrophic, which is likely why the events involving Meghan Markle and the staffer were locked down with such intensity. On the morning of the funeral, the inner workings of the palace were operating like clockwork, albeit under immense emotional strain. Staff had worked around the clock for days, overseeing everything from floral arrangements to security logistics to dietary preferences of attending dignitaries. Nothing could be out of place. Every tray of food, every polished surface, every carefully timed movement had to adhere to the monarchy's image of excellence. In this environment, emotions ran high and tempers were easily frayed. Multiple insiders later recounted how Meghan, already under intense scrutiny from both the public and her in-laws, appeared restless and easily agitated that day. The pressure of the occasion, combined with a strained dynamic with the royal household, seemed to reach a boiling point. According to sources familiar with the inner proceedings, Meghan had been assigned a small reception room within the palace during the early hours of the funeral day. It was in this room, near the hallway adjacent to a catering prep station, that the first signs of discord began to unfold. Initial whispers began with complaints over food, something seemingly small, but symbolic of a larger pattern of tension. Meghan had reportedly made special dietary requests earlier that week, and while the staff attempted to meet those specifications, a miscommunication allegedly led to the wrong tray being brought to her. It was a trivial mistake in the grand scheme of the day, but it became a spark in a powder keg. Staffers described her demeanor in that moment as sharp, curt, and visibly frustrated. The young aide tasked with correcting the mistake, a junior staff member new to the household, was summoned quietly and asked to bring in a replacement. What happened next was far from quiet. As described in multiple anonymous accounts, later substantiated by the now public video, Meghan allegedly confronted the staffer directly in the corridor, her voice elevated but not quite shouting. The staffer, attempting to explain the mix-up, was cut off repeatedly. Then, in what sources call a stunning display of anger, Meghan allegedly grabbed a plated food item from a tray, turned, and with a deliberate motion, threw it toward the staffer. The food struck the young woman's chest and slid down her uniform, leaving a visible mark not just physically, but emotionally. There was a pause, not dramatic, not cinematic, but raw and heavy. One witness described it as the most awkward silence they'd ever experienced in the palace. Everyone froze. The staffer, eyes wide and face burning with shock, didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply looked around at the other aides who had witnessed it, waiting for someone, anyone, to say something. But no one did. And Meghan, standing a few feet away, allegedly issued a cold directive that has now become a focal point of outrage. You will not speak of this again. To anyone. It wasn't yelled. It wasn't whispered. It was firm, controlled, and, according to those who heard it, chilling. The staffer reportedly nodded, turned around, and walked briskly away, disappearing into the palace's labyrinth of back corridors. She didn't return to her assigned station for the remainder of the day. Her replacement arrived within minutes, with no explanation provided. For those few who witnessed the scene, there was no debrief, no apology, no formal reprimand. Just silence and fear. What happened in the hours that followed was a rapid and quiet lockdown of information. Senior aides allegedly instructed everyone to avoid discussing what had occurred. There were whispers of confiscated phones, deleted footage, and personal warnings delivered in private. The incident became something of an unspoken legend among lower-ranking staff, referred to only in hushed tones, with carefully vague language. No one dared put anything in writing. Nothing was reported publicly. Nothing was leaked. Until now, the footage that resurfaced came from an unexpected place. It wasn't a palace CCTV feed, nor was it captured by a member of the press. It came from a staffer's personal device, someone who had happened to step into the corridor moments before the confrontation and began filming discreetly when raised voices were heard. Whether the video was originally intended to be used as evidence or was kept out of fear remains unclear. But what is clear now is that it exists. It shows the food being thrown. It shows the impact. It captures Meghan's words. It exposes the moment that the world was never meant to see. The video has already sparked outrage. Some are calling for a formal investigation. Others are questioning how such a moment could have been buried for so long. And still others, especially Meghan's defenders, are urging caution, suggesting the video could be misleading or taken out of context. But context or not, what it captures is undeniable. A jarring contradiction to the image of unity and grace that the palace worked so hard to preserve that day. Why is this so significant? Because it goes beyond a single act of disrespect. It challenges the integrity of a system built on illusion, on the belief that royalty is above chaos, above cruelty, above the human flaws that plague everyone else. And in doing so, it invites deeper questions about accountability, about protection, and about the price paid by those who serve silently in the background. The funeral may have been watched by billions, but the scene that mattered most that day happened far from the cameras, in a narrow hallway, with no audience but a few frightened staffers and one camera phone. The world saw a nation grieving its monarch, but it didn't see a staffer wiping food from her chest. It didn't hear the command to stay quiet. It didn't see the royal mask slip. To fully grasp the significance of what occurred during Queen Elizabeth's funeral, the food-throwing incident and the silencing that followed, one must step back and examine a deeper, darker thread running through Meghan Markle's history with royal staff. This wasn't an isolated moment of stress during an emotionally charged day. For many insiders, it was part of a pattern, a culmination of long-simmering tensions, reports of mistreatment, and private complaints that had, until now, been swept aside by palace discretion and the fiercely managed public image of the Duchess of Sussex. When Meghan Markle first joined the royal family, the excitement in the palace corridors was palpable. Here was a biracial American actress marrying into one of the oldest monarchies in the world. It felt historic, progressive, modern. Staff who had served for decades believed they were witnessing a turning point in royal tradition. But within months, the mood began to shift. What began as whispered discomfort soon evolved into formal HR complaints, some of which have since become public, and a wave of resignations that palace insiders quietly referred to as the Sussex Exodus. By early 2019, the cracks behind the royal walls were no longer easy to ignore. Multiple staffers had either left or requested to be reassigned. One by one, private secretaries, personal assistants, and aides departed their posts after only months of working with the Sussexes. Meghan's defenders painted the departures as unfortunate coincidences, often attributing them to the pressures of royal life or the intensity of the spotlight. But privately, former employees told a much different story, one that painted a picture of a work environment driven by unrealistic demands, cold detachment, and moments of open hostility. One former aide, who spoke under condition of anonymity, described her experience as emotionally grueling. "I've worked for high-level officials before. I've worked in high-pressure environments. But nothing prepared me for the emotional toll of working for Meghan," she said. There was no room for error. Everything had to be perfect. And if it wasn't, the way she'd look at you, the way she'd speak to you, you were reduced to nothing. It wasn't yelling. It was quieter than that, more controlled, which made it worse. Her account mirrored many of the testimonies later submitted to palace HR officials. Some staff described being completely broken, suffering from anxiety and insomnia. One aide reportedly broke down in tears after a confrontation over a minor scheduling issue. Another claimed she was subject to a campaign of humiliation, where any mistake was magnified and discussed within Meghan's inner circle. The palace was not blind to these complaints. In fact, according to internal sources, there was growing concern among senior officials about how to address the situation without inflaming public opinion or damaging the fragile unity of the royal family. At the time, the palace was still reeling from Prince Andrew's scandal and the fallout from Brexit. The last thing it needed was another public fracture. So it did what it often does. It closed ranks, managed the narrative, and quietly discouraged further complaints from being escalated. But the issue refused to stay buried. In early 2021, as Meghan and Harry's explosive interview with Oprah Winfrey approached, a series of damaging reports emerged. The most notable was a leak to the Times of London in which former palace aides accused Meghan of bullying during her time as a working royal. The report alleged that Meghan had driven two personal assistants out of the household and undermined the confidence of a third. It cited an email from Jason Knopf, a former communications secretary to the Sussexes, who had allegedly raised concerns about Meghan's behavior in 2018. In that now infamous email, Knopf wrote that he was very concerned that Meghan was able to bully two PAs out of the household in the past year, and that the Duchess seems intent on always having someone in her sights. He added, "I remain concerned that nothing will be done." The Sussexes quickly responded, denouncing the allegations as a calculated smear campaign timed to derail their Oprah interview. Meghan's lawyers claimed she was saddened by the attacks and reiterated her long-standing commitment to empowering women and creating inclusive workplaces. But the damage had been done. The story introduced doubt. It raised uncomfortable questions, and it made future staffers more cautious, more hesitant to trust that the institution would protect them if they spoke up. Yet even with that public outcry, little changed behind the scenes. The palace's response was muted, stating only that it would look into the allegations. No formal report was released to the public. No disciplinary action was announced. The findings of the internal investigation were said to be kept private to protect those involved. And for the aides who had risked everything to speak up, the message was loud and clear. The Crown protects its image, not its workers. Fast forward to Queen Elizabeth's funeral, and you begin to understand the atmosphere within the palace. It was not simply a day of mourning. It was a pressure cooker. The staff had worked with relentless precision to ensure that nothing went wrong, that every moment was dignified, every step choreographed. And for those who had witnessed or endured Meghan's behavior before, her presence at such a sacred event brought back anxiety. They were expected to serve, to be invisible, to endure, even if it meant enduring disrespect. Insiders who were there that day say the staff was on edge from the moment Meghan arrived. Her demands began early: small adjustments to her private room, clarifications about protocol, concerns over seating arrangements. These weren't unusual in themselves. All royals make requests. But what stood out was the tone. According to one senior aide, it was the way she asked for things. There's a line between confidence and contempt, and she often crossed it. It wasn't just the tone. It was the looks, the quiet, dismissive gestures, the refusal to acknowledge certain staff. For many, it felt like a performance, not for the cameras, but for power. One insider described it as a daily display of who held authority, even in grief. So when the food-throwing incident occurred, it wasn't viewed by palace staff as an outlier. It was seen as a consequence of years of unchecked behavior. And more tragically, it was anticipated, if not in form, then in substance. The staffer who was allegedly targeted that day was among the youngest working the event. She had only been at the palace for 4 months. Her duties were limited to hospitality, assisting with refreshments, relaying information between stations, and ensuring the royals were undisturbed. She was not a high-ranking official. She was not someone with political capital. She was, in many ways, the ideal scapegoat. In the days that followed the funeral, the young woman reportedly stopped showing up to work. Her supervisors said she was on leave. Others quietly whispered that she had resigned. Her name was scrubbed from internal rosters. No formal announcement was made. No statement of gratitude. She simply disappeared, another invisible casualty of the royal machine. The palace's handling of past staff complaints casts a long shadow over what happened that day. It suggests a culture not just of hierarchy, but of indifference, where those at the top are protected at all costs, and those at the bottom are expected to suffer in silence. It's not just about Meghan. It's about the system that allowed her behavior, if these reports are to be believed, to continue unchecked. The resurfaced footage of the incident didn't just reignite outrage about a single moment. It reopened old wounds. Former staffers began talking again, quietly, anonymously, fearfully. Some confirmed what the video appeared to show. Others added their own stories, moments of disrespect, sudden outbursts, emotional manipulation. Each testimony added weight to the growing narrative that Meghan's relationship with palace staff had been anything but harmonious. And now, with the world watching, the question isn't just whether Meghan Markle crossed a line during the Queen's funeral. It's whether the institution she married into ever had the courage or the will to hold her accountable. Because buried beneath the pageantry of royalty is a simple truth. The people who make the monarchy function are human. They have feelings, limits, and when their pain is ignored in the name of public image, the cost is more than emotional. It's institutional. It's cultural. It's corrosive. And now, the cost has finally come due. It was September 19th, 2022, the day the United Kingdom buried its longest reigning monarch. Streets had emptied. Flags across the nation hung at half-mast. Millions paused to mourn, their televisions flickering with the slow, majestic images of Queen Elizabeth II's casket as it made its final journey from Westminster Abbey to Windsor. Inside the palace, however, another procession unfolded, one unseen by the world, one carried out not in public view, but behind closed doors and beneath the weight of invisible expectations. And within those stone halls, in the quiet shadows where the royal machine truly operated, a single moment shattered the illusion of harmony. That morning began like many others in the lead-up to a major royal event. Precise, regulated, tense. Palace aides had worked through the night to prepare everything from the ceremonial attire to the food stations that would support the dozens of members of the royal household, visiting dignitaries, and their respective entourages. Staffers, some of whom had worked for the Queen for decades, moved like clockwork through the internal wings of Buckingham Palace. No emotion. No hesitation. Just duty. But for a select group stationed in the West Corridor, near one of the smaller kitchens that had been converted into a prep area for the morning reception, the day would take a different turn. This was the corridor that ran parallel to the private family antechambers. Reserved for immediate royals and their staff, it wasn't an area open to the general palace workforce. Only designated individuals with proper clearance were allowed to operate there, which made the events that occurred all the more shocking, and all the more difficult to explain away. By 9:15 a.m., Meghan Markle had already arrived. According to internal logs later leaked to the press, she and Prince Harry were escorted through the rear courtyard under heightened security. Though tensions within the family were running high, given the Sussexes' strained relationship with the monarchy, the overarching theme of the day was unity. The Queen was gone. Grudges were to be put aside. Appearances were paramount. From the outside, Meghan appeared composed. Photographers captured her exiting the vehicle with a solemn expression, dressed in a tailored black ensemble that adhered perfectly to mourning protocol. She nodded at staff, offered brief greetings, and walked briskly alongside Harry. But behind the scenes, according to several sources, and now the leaked video, the mood shifted quickly once she entered the reception area set aside for family refreshment. At approximately 9:30 a.m., Meghan was escorted to a private lounge room set up with refreshments and a quiet space to prepare before the formal service. The staff in charge of this room had been carefully briefed on her preferences, her dietary needs, her expected beverage options, even the arrangement of seating and lighting. Everything had been considered, but as one senior aide would later state, it doesn't matter how much you prepare when someone is determined to find fault. What triggered the incident remains a subject of fierce speculation. Some say the tea served was too cold. Others claim the pastry selection did not match her earlier requests. One account suggests Meghan had asked for a fresh tray of vegan quiches, only to be presented with a selection that included cheese. Whatever the cause, what's agreed upon by multiple palace insiders is that her reaction was swift and escalated with alarming speed. The young staffer involved, a woman in her mid-20s, newly assigned to the royal household, had been tasked with replenishing the trays and ensuring the Duchess's lounge remained undisturbed. According to colleagues, she was enthusiastic, nervous, and completely unaware of the undercurrents running beneath the royal surface. She had reportedly joined the palace staff only a few months prior, coming from a background in hospitality, and saw this role as a prestigious stepping stone. That morning, she was moving between two kitchens, checking tray arrangements and timing deliveries. Around 9:40 a.m., she entered the Duchess's room with a new tray of food, only to be greeted with visible displeasure. Meghan, according to witness reports, immediately questioned the contents. The staffer began to explain that it was the selection provided by the dietary team. But her explanation was cut short. "You've been told more than once," Meghan allegedly said, according to one aide standing nearby. Her voice was not raised, but it was firm, curt, laced with impatience. "This is not acceptable." The staffer apologized, attempting to clarify that she was simply relaying what the kitchen had prepared. She reportedly offered to replace the tray immediately, but it wasn't enough. At that moment, according to the now-leaked footage and corroborating witness testimony, Meghan stood, walked over to the tray, and picked up one of the food items. A small tart or quiche, possibly still warm. With deliberate motion, she turned and flung the item in the staffer's direction. It struck the young woman squarely in the chest. The reaction in the room was one of stunned silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The staffer froze, her eyes wide. She looked down at the food now staining her blouse, then back up at Meghan, whose expression, as described by those present, remained unflinching. There was no apology, no visible regret. Instead, Meghan reportedly issued a chilling command: "Clean yourself up, and don't speak of this again." The staffer, visibly shaken, nodded quietly and backed out of the room. She did not return for the remainder of the morning. Another aide was dispatched to replace her within 10 minutes, with no explanation given. The aftermath of the incident unfolded quietly but rapidly. One senior staffer, deeply disturbed by what he had witnessed, approached his supervisor to report the behavior. According to internal memos obtained later, he was told, in no uncertain terms, to stand down. There was a funeral in progress. No disruptions. No stories. No media leaks. The moment, however unsettling, would be dealt with after the Queen's interment. But it never was. Behind closed doors, panic spread. Security staff were informed that unauthorized recordings might exist. Palace IT specialists were instructed to begin sweeping devices. Some personal phones were reportedly collected under the pretense of security audits. Others were scanned for data before being returned. Nothing was put in writing. No formal disciplinary action was taken. But the directive was clear: shut it down. One aide later described the atmosphere as suffocating. "We weren't just told to forget it. We were made to feel like we were the ones who had done something wrong by witnessing it." The staffer who had been hit did not file an official complaint. According to colleagues, she was advised that doing so could jeopardize her position and create unnecessary public distraction. She was instead offered counseling through internal channels and eventually transferred to a less visible role. The video footage that now circulates online, captured by a nearby staffer who had stepped into the hallway moments before the confrontation, adds a haunting layer of authenticity to these accounts. Though the angle is limited, the audio is clear. It captures Meghan's voice, the sound of the thrown item hitting fabric, and the low, shocked intake of breath that followed. Forensic analysts reviewing the video say the timestamp matches the Queen's funeral morning. And though Meghan's legal team has strongly denied any wrongdoing, the silence from Buckingham Palace speaks volumes. The footage has ignited a firestorm of speculation. How did such a moment of alleged aggression go unreported? Why was the victim of the incident silenced rather than protected? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what does it say about the values of an institution that would rather erase truth than confront discomfort? This chapter of the story is not just about a hallway or a tray of food. It's about the weight of unchecked power, the fear of retribution, and the quiet complicity of an institution built to maintain perfection at any cost. For the young woman at the center of it all, her life changed in a matter of seconds. From hopeful palace aide to invisible casualty of a royal secret. And though the world didn't see her that day, didn't witness her humiliation or hear her silence, the camera did. And now, so does everyone else. The immediate aftermath of the incident was not marked by outrage or confrontation. It was marked by stillness. The kind of hollow, anxious silence that fills a room after something traumatic has happened, but no one knows what to do next. For those who were present in the West Corridor of Buckingham Palace that day, aides, junior staff, catering personnel, the moments following Meghan Markle's alleged outburst felt surreal. What had just occurred wasn't part of the funeral's program. It wasn't covered by protocol, and there was no royal handbook to explain what to do when a duchess throws food at a subordinate and demands silence. Within minutes, the affected staffer had disappeared from the area. Her departure was swift, her head low, and her uniform stained. A colleague who crossed paths with her just outside the corridor would later describe her face as completely blank, as if she'd left her body behind. No tears, no protest, just retreat. She did not return for her remaining shift. She did not speak to anyone except her direct superior, and even that was behind a locked door. By the time the funeral ceremony officially began at Westminster Abbey, she was no longer inside the palace walls. The royal machine did what it always does when faced with disruption. It absorbed the incident, buried the noise, and continued forward without a visible hitch. But inside, behind the solemn music and regal composure of the Queen's farewell, the palace staff was already in quiet disarray. The unspoken rule had been broken. Something had happened that couldn't be easily dismissed, and yet no one dared speak too loudly about it. What made the silence even more disturbing was the speed at which it was orchestrated. According to insiders, within 2 hours of the alleged incident, at least 4 senior palace staff had been briefed, not about the event in detail, but about the fact that an unfortunate misunderstanding had taken place. The language used in these conversations was described as careful, deliberate, and void of accountability. The priority, as always, was containment, not resolution. Staffers who had witnessed the moment firsthand were summoned individually. Each was spoken to in private, asked not to discuss what they'd seen. No written statements were taken. No official inquiry launched. It was all informal, quiet warnings disguised as concern, reminders of confidentiality agreements, subtle suggestions that careers could be affected by unnecessary drama. To speak out would be to disrupt the single most important royal event in a generation. And for those who had worked years, even decades, to reach their positions, that threat didn't need to be spoken aloud. It hovered unspoken in the air. The young woman who had been on the receiving end of the alleged assault was, according to several sources, offered a day off. It wasn't framed as a punishment or a concession, more like a cooling-off period. She was told not to come in the following day, and that someone from Human Resources would reach out. But that call never came. Instead, over the next 48 hours, her access credentials were quietly revoked. Her staff badge no longer granted her entry through her usual entrance. She wasn't scheduled on any upcoming rosters. Her internal communications account was disabled. And though she received a paycheck at the end of the month, no explanation was ever offered for her apparent removal. She simply vanished from palace life without a word. For the few colleagues who knew her personally, this disappearance was haunting. It was like she never existed. One staffer later said, "We were told not to ask questions. We were told she had been reassigned, but no one knew where." One friend from the catering department tried to call her, but the number had been disconnected. Another sent an email and never received a reply. It was as if the palace had made her untraceable, for her protection or their own. But not everyone inside the palace accepted the silence so easily. There were quiet murmurs, discontent, questions that echoed through whispered hallway conversations. Why hadn't Meghan apologized? Why was no one talking about what really happened? And most pressing of all, what if it happened again? Several mid-ranking staff members considered filing a group report, not necessarily to bring charges, but to ensure that what happened was documented. Yet even this small act of defiance was met with resistance. One senior advisor reportedly reminded them that the palace was still in mourning, and that this was not the time for internal politics. Another said flatly, "Do not become the story." The message was clear: the Queen had died. The world was watching. Any disruption from within would be seen as betrayal. And so, silence ruled once more. That silence was later reinforced by an unusually aggressive response from the Sussex's legal team. Within a week of the funeral, confidential notices were reportedly sent to several media outlets, reminding them of defamation laws and cautioning against publishing unsubstantiated rumors involving senior royals. Though these notices did not directly reference the incident, the timing was suspicious. Media organizations, already wary of legal entanglements, steered clear. Even tabloids known for salacious headlines stayed quiet. A major publication reportedly shelved a piece after receiving a phone call from a very senior intermediary. The story had become radioactive. What was less known at the time was that someone had already copied the footage. The staffer who had accidentally captured the moment on video, a catering assistant who had stepped into the hallway to deliver a time-sensitive note, had kept a copy of the clip on a personal device. Whether out of fear, conscience, or a desire to protect a colleague, they had backed it up before security could intervene. And for nearly 2 years, that video remained hidden. Not deleted, not forgotten, just waiting. In the months that followed, those who had witnessed the incident moved on. Some were reassigned. Others left the palace entirely. A few stayed, but learned to speak even less. And the staffer at the center of it all? She reportedly relocated to a small town in northern England. Friends say she avoided discussing her time at the palace. Her family, equally protective, refused all interview requests. She disappeared from public view. A ghost of a story that no one had ever been allowed to tell. Until now. The resurfacing of the footage has reopened every wound that had been so carefully concealed. It has brought the staffer's story back to the forefront, not as a rumor, but as a visible, audible, undeniable moment of disgrace. And it has forced the institution to confront something it dreads above all else: its own failure to protect the vulnerable within its walls. What makes the silence so deafening is the sheer weight of the institution behind it. The palace, after all, is not just a building. It is a fortress of tradition, hierarchy, and unspoken codes. And in this case, those codes ensured that an alleged assault was never addressed, that the person who suffered was erased, that the person who allegedly committed it continued on, untarnished. For critics of the monarchy, the incident represents more than a scandal. It's a symbol of rot beneath the gold, a sign that power, when unchecked, can turn toxic. That behind the velvet curtains and royal titles, real people suffer. For supporters of Meghan Markle, however, the resurfacing of the video has sparked a different reaction. They argue that the clip could be manipulated, that context matters, that the Duchess has long been a target of media hostility and racial bias. Some have pointed out the timing of the video's release, questioning whether it is part of a wider campaign to discredit her. And while those questions deserve to be explored, they do not erase the faces of those who watched the incident happen, the staff who lived it, the woman who walked away with more than food on her clothes, but a scar on her trust. What happened in the hours after the Queen's funeral was not just about protecting Meghan Markle. It was about protecting the illusion, the idea that the monarchy, even in its darkest moments, remains infallible. But illusions have limits. And when truth breaks through, no matter how small the crack, the silence that follows can be deafening. In every royal crisis, there is a moment where the institution must decide whether to extinguish the flames or quietly let them burn behind a closed door. For the British monarchy, with its centuries-old reliance on protocol, secrecy, and calculated image control, that moment came swiftly after the incident involving Meghan Markle and the palace staffer during Queen Elizabeth II's funeral. And when that moment came, the machine moved fast. The figure at the helm of that machine was not a public royal, not a courtier whose name adorned headlines, but rather a man known simply as the Fixer. To outsiders, he is invisible. No public profile, no media trail. Yet within the walls of Buckingham Palace and the royal household, his presence is unmistakable, quiet, strategic, and deployed only when scandal threatens to leak into public perception. His role is unofficial. His power, very real. He has served multiple monarchs, survived political storms, and buried stories so explosive they could have reshaped royal history. In the aftermath of the funeral incident, his mission was clear: contain the fallout, neutralize the staff, and erase all traces before the media caught a scent. According to sources within the palace infrastructure, the Fixer was notified within hours of the altercation. A private call was placed from a senior aide who had witnessed Meghan's alleged behavior and was growing increasingly concerned about the optics. It wasn't just the food being thrown, it was the look in the staffer's eyes, the silence in the room, and the realization that this moment, if seen or recorded, could bring public humiliation at the worst possible time. The Queen's funeral wasn't just about honoring a monarch. It was about passing the baton of stability to King Charles. An incident like this risked igniting a firestorm. The Fixer arrived before noon. He entered not through the main gates, but via the palace's discreet south entrance used for private security and high-level guests. No announcement was made. No log entry was filed under his name. But by 12:10 p.m., he was seated in a private operations room with key figures from the HR division, communications officers, and a few trusted senior staff. The atmosphere was clinical, tense, and familiar. They had done this before. The first order of business was data control. Every staff member who had been in or near the West Corridor that morning was identified and logged. Their schedules were analyzed to determine how long they had spent within potential sight lines of the incident. Mobile phone data was flagged. Anyone with access to the lounge, catering prep area, or internal service hallways during the time frame in question was prioritized. The goal wasn't just to understand who might have seen the incident. It was to determine who might have captured it. One by one, selected staff were quietly called into closed-door meetings under the guise of post-funeral protocol reviews. There were no threats, no raised voices, just veiled questions about unusual behavior, unofficial recordings, and discretion. Staff were reminded of their employment contracts, which included comprehensive confidentiality clauses. Some were asked to voluntarily present their phones for routine scans. Others were told their devices had flagged as security anomalies. It was an operation wrapped in calm efficiency, but behind the polite smiles and polished language was a message no one could miss. We are watching. By mid-afternoon, Palace IT teams had launched internal audits of the security camera system. While most of the public-facing cameras were managed by external contractors for public safety, the internal surveillance network, especially in private corridors, was closely monitored by the palace's own tech department. It was here that a discovery was made. A 38-second window of missing footage from the hallway in question. Not deleted, not corrupted, just gone. This wasn't the first time such a gap had occurred. The fixer knew the signs. It was likely an internal staffer had manually overridden the system or the recording server had experienced a silent reboot. Either way, the absence of footage posed two critical problems. First, it meant the palace couldn't control the narrative with official recordings. Second, it suggested that someone might have recorded the incident privately. That possibility, that a clip of Meghan Markle allegedly throwing food at a palace aide existed and was outside their control, triggered the second phase of the operation, threat assessment. The fixer requested a full rundown on the staffer who had been targeted. Her name, background, employment history, and behavioral notes were compiled into a file. She was flagged as a potential vulnerability, not for being disloyal, but for being emotionally compromised and therefore unpredictable. The notes described her as young, new, emotionally affected, and not yet proven in high-pressure discretion scenarios. In short, she was someone who might talk. Her movements were quietly monitored. She had not returned home after the funeral, but had gone to stay with a cousin outside of London. Surveillance was not overt, but her communication channels were flagged through internal networks, a process justified under the palace's existing cybersecurity measures. Any indication that she had shared her experience or planned to go public would have triggered immediate action. But for now, she remained silent. The fixer then turned to the core of the problem, Meghan. The royal family's communication strategy around the Duchess of Sussex had long been delicate. Her entrance into the family had brought both opportunity and volatility. Public opinion was deeply divided. Some hailed her as a breath of modernity, others as a threat to royal continuity. Any disciplinary or corrective action against her would ignite media infernos on both sides. But the Queen had just died. There was a narrow window in which all negative stories could be absorbed into the fog of grief and public mourning. It was in this context that the fixer devised a response, not to defend Meghan, not to accuse her, but to redirect attention. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. First, neutralize the internal threat. Then, divert media attention to more acceptable controversies. A few well-placed leaks about minor scheduling disagreements within the family began to circulate. Tabloids picked up stories of tension between William and Harry, frosty moments between Camilla and Meghan, and a disputed seating arrangement at the funeral reception. These were distractions, not damaging, but engaging enough to dominate headlines. As journalists followed the drama, the real story remained buried. Internally, the palace issued a quiet directive to press handlers: no comment on staff behavior or internal logistics during the funeral. If questioned, spokespeople were to express regret for any stress caused by such an emotional event and pivot immediately to praising the Queen's legacy. It worked, for a time, but there was still one variable the fixer could not control: the staffer who had filmed the incident. According to later whistleblower reports, that individual, a catering assistant who had paused in the hallway at the exact moment of the altercation, had not intended to record anything malicious. He had heard raised voices, had pulled out his phone out of curiosity, and had captured more than he expected. When the sweep of phones began, he panicked. Rather than deleting the footage, he backed it up on a personal cloud account. He didn't trust the palace, and he didn't know who to give it to. For nearly 2 years, he kept the clip hidden, afraid of losing his job, or worse, being blacklisted. It wasn't until he left royal employment and moved abroad that he began quietly exploring how to leak the video without exposing himself. He contacted journalists through encrypted messaging apps. He met with a whistleblower advocacy group in secret. And eventually, he found someone who would listen. The fixer had done everything right, by the standards of his job. The story had been buried. The staffer silenced. The institution protected. But in the digital age, no secret stays buried forever. And when the video finally reached public eyes, the damage was irreversible. What this chapter reveals is not just the efficiency of the royal machine in containing scandal. It reveals the terrifying ease with which human suffering can be minimized in the name of optics. The staffer who was humiliated never received an apology. The witnesses were never debriefed. Meghan Markle, as far as records show, was never questioned. The institution moved on, business as usual, and at the center of it all stood the fixer, a man without a name to the public, a ghost in a tailored suit, cleaning up royal messes so that the crown could shine untarnished. It was one thing to hear about an unfortunate incident behind closed doors of Buckingham Palace. It was another entirely for Prince Harry to discover that his wife, the woman he had left behind his own country and family for, had allegedly thrown food at a junior staffer and ordered her to stay silent. To understand Harry's response, we must retrace the steps of his emotional journey on that fateful day, examine the private conversations that would follow, and explore how his loyalties would pull him in conflicting directions, between defending his wife and preserving his own public image, between the instinct to protect and the duty to truth. The morning of the Queen's funeral had been emotionally overwhelming for Harry from the outset. The death of his grandmother, who he had referred to as Granny, struck him deeply. Publicly, he appeared composed, poised to fulfill his role as a senior royal. Behind closed doors, according to insiders, he was struggling. He had spent the previous days shuttling between protocol briefings, family gatherings, and private moments of grief. Each time he donned his uniform or straightened his tie, he carried the weight of expectation to stand strong, unwavering, an emblem of continuity for a mourning nation. Meghan had been a constant presence by his side. She offered solace, companionship, and an unspoken reminder of their shared decision to step back from royal duties 2 years earlier. But the palace environment that morning was charged with reminders of everything they had left behind. Royal security protocols, endless media attention, and the invisible hierarchy that placed them, even as a couple, beneath certain family members. Tensions simmered quietly, fed by whispered resentments and old wounds. According to those close to Harry, he noticed Meghan's irritability early on. He attributed it to exhaustion and grief. He assumed that missing dietary preferences or seating details were minor irritants in the face of their collective sorrow. He tried to reassure her, soft words in private corridors, gentle touches on her arm. Anything to calm the tension he saw crackling around her. At times, he appeared genuinely concerned that the stresses of the event were overwhelming her. What Harry did not witness, however, was the hallway incident itself. He was preparing for the procession, reviewing his march order, and offering last-minute counsel to his security detail. By the time Meghan emerged from the private lounge, Harry was already moving toward the chapel entrance. He did not see the food arc through the air. He did not hear Meghan's directive to the staffer. He only knew that when he later inquired about his wife's mood, he was met with an evasive response, a clipped acknowledgement that she was fine and did not wish to discuss it. It was only after the funeral, when the formal service concluded and family members began gathering privately, that Harry first heard rumors of what had taken place. A discreet message from a trusted aide simply read, "We need to talk." Concern crept into his features. He pulled Meghan aside, suggesting they step into a private chamber away from prying ears. There, in hushed tones, he asked what had happened. According to two aides who later recounted the exchange, Meghan downplayed the incident at first, calling it nothing serious, insisting it was a minor miscommunication over dietary arrangements. Harry nodded, though his jaw tightened. He pressed gently. "Are you sure? I've heard different versions." Meghan's eyes darkened. She gave him a look that insiders described as a mixture of defiance and desperation. She said she didn't want to talk about it. She wanted to move on. She reminded him they were at his grandmother's funeral, that they needed to focus on their roles, not petty disputes with staff. Harry, torn between his protective instincts and his discomfort at the allegations, accepted her assurance, and the matter was dropped in that moment. That night, however, sleep evaded him. In the privacy of their quarters, Harry replayed the conversation over and over. He thought back to the look on the staffer's face he had glimpsed briefly outside the lounge. Was that fear? Was that shame? He wasn't sure. He wondered if Meghan's behavior was out of character or part of a pattern he hadn't yet fully acknowledged. His mind drifted back to previous rumors he had heard during their Sussex years, about staff departures, whispered complaints, and late-night checks by palace security. He had shrugged them off then, unwilling to question his wife in public or confront the institution he had abandoned. The following morning, as the world awoke to headlines of unity and commemoration, Harry was presented with an internal palace memo. It noted that some staff had experienced distressing events during the funeral day, without naming names or specifics. The memo asked recipients to remind any colleagues affected to contact HR. It was a standard welfare message, or so it seemed on the surface. But Harry sensed something more, an attempt to bury inconvenient details under the guise of routine support. He decided to take action. He summoned his private secretary and asked for an unredacted brief on the incident. He demanded to know what had happened, who was involved, and what steps the palace intended to take. The response he received was cautious. His secretary expressed regret that Harry had to learn of it in this manner and suggested that because Meghan was involved, the palace would handle follow-up privately. Harry's discomfort gave way to frustration. He felt caught between his role as a husband and his duty as a public figure. If he defended Meghan unequivocally, he risked appearing complicit in silencing a staffer. If he demanded an investigation, he risked fueling a scandal that could tarnish the family at a time when unity was paramount. And yet, the more he sat on the information, the more he felt he was betraying both the staffer and his own sense of integrity. In the days that followed, Harry attempted to navigate a middle path. He approached the palace's HR lead, who was sympathetic but insisted confidentiality constraints prevented any public disclosure. She assured him that the staffer had been offered support and would not face retaliation for coming forward. Harry requested proof of that outreach. An email record, some documentation, but was told that those records were sealed under privacy protocols. Meanwhile, Meghan's camp was mobilizing. They had caught wind of Harry's inquiries. Meghan felt betrayed by the palace's attempts to manage the narrative without her input and was furious at Harry for reopening the matter after she had asked him to leave it alone. Their private rift, once focused on media coverage and security arrangements, had shifted to something deeper: trust and truth. One confidant later described a heated exchange between the couple in their private quarters. Meghan, voice raised with uncharacteristic anger, accused Harry of undermining her and handing their personal matters over to his former institution. Harry, voice trembling with frustration, demanded transparency and accountability, not just for the palace, but for their own relationship. He insisted that if she wanted his loyalty, she had to be honest about what happened and allow him to seek redress for the staffer. The argument ended without resolution. Meghan retreated into silence, and Harry left the room, a mixture of guilt and resolve settling over him. He confronted the painful reality that his detachment from royal life had not spared him from its norms and expectations. In fact, those norms still held sway over him, shaping his actions whether he liked it or not. Publicly, Harry maintained a composed exterior. He and Meghan made their scheduled appearances at memorial services and private family gatherings. They returned to Frogmore Cottage under heightened security, facing a media landscape eager for morsels of drama. Yet neither addressed the funeral incident. Official photos showed them side by side, her arm linked through his, both gazing at solemn memorials. The world saw unity. Harry felt conflict. It was only months later, during a candid interview for a streaming documentary, that Harry found a measure of release. Speaking about his humanitarian work, his mental health struggles, and his fractured relationship with the royal institution, he allowed himself to reflect on the challenge of reconciling personal loyalty with moral responsibility. Though he did not name Meghan or the staffer, he spoke generally about learning the importance of accountability, about how silence can be as destructive as any action. Those comments, widely reported, hinted at internal turmoil and drew renewed speculation about what had happened at the funeral. For Meghan, the documentary was incendiary. She felt betrayed by the public airing of Harry's emotional journey. She interpreted his comments as a veiled critique of her, a sign that he had sided with the institution over his spouse. The couple's dynamic shifted visibly in subsequent appearances, their once synchronized walk and mutual support replaced by subtle distances, brief nods instead of warm glances. Behind the scenes, the incident remained uninvestigated. The staffer, meanwhile, had moved on. She never received formal acknowledgement or apology. She did not speak publicly, but her presence lingered in Harry's mind. In private moments, he would write in his journal, torn between regret that the young woman's dignity had been violated and guilt that he had not done more to protect her when he had the chance. In early 2023, almost a year after the funeral, Harry quietly donated to a non-profit organization supporting workplace rights and bullying prevention in high-pressure environments. He did so anonymously, seeking to address the broader issue without drawing attention to his own tragedy. To insiders, this was his way of atoning, an unspoken apology to the staffer and to all those who suffered in silence under the palace's polished facade. Yet the question remained, could Harry ever fully escape the gravitational pull of royalty and its unspoken codes? Or would his loyalties always be torn between protecting his wife and honoring his sense of justice? The resurfacing of the footage has forced Harry to confront these questions publicly. He now faces the dilemma all too familiar to him: speak out and risk fracturing his family still further, or stay silent and betray the memory of the Queen's call for integrity. In the end, Harry's response to the funeral incident reveals the painful complexity of loyalty in a world where truth is often sacrificed to preserve image. It shows a man caught between the love for his spouse and the drive to defend the vulnerable, an inner conflict that no palace protocol can resolve.